The dust of the Via Appia still coated his sandals as Lucius first laid eyes on the Flavian amphitheater, its colossal stone arches blocking out the sun. He had traveled for weeks from his quiet provincial town, a young scribe summoned to the heart of the empire to document its greatest spectacles. The sheer scale of Rome was overwhelming, a chaotic symphony of shouting merchants, clattering carts, and the distant rhythmic roar of a crowd that seemed to shake the very ground. That roar was his destination, a sound both magnetic and menacing, pulling him toward the arena gates like a tide. Inside, the world narrowed to a bowl of screaming humanity and blood-soaked sand. The heat was stifling, thick with the smell of sweat, perfume, and something metallic and foul he could not yet name. He found his assigned seat, his stylus and wax tablet feeling absurdly small and fragile in his hands. Below, the arena floor was a vast stage of pale sand, already stained in dark, irregular patches. His task was to record, to observe dispassionately, but his stomach tightened with a primal dread he had not anticipated. The games began not with a ceremony, but with a sudden, brutal efficiency. Men, condemned and chained, were driven into the center. They wore no armor, carried no weapons. Their faces were masks of terrified resignation. From opposite gates, professional gladiators emerged, shining in polished bronze and steel, moving with the calm precision of butchers. What followed was not a fight, but a slaughter, a one-sided massacre met with ecstatic approval from the tiers above. Each fall was cheered, each spurt of blood celebrated. Lucius's hand trembled, making his first notations shaky and blurred. He had heard stories of the games, of course, but the stories were pale, lifeless things compared to the visceral reality of a body collapsing into the dirt, the sound of a sword-cleaving bone, the way the sand drank the blood so hungrily. This was not the glorious Rome of poets and philosophers he had imagined. This was something else entirely. A monstrous engine of death whose purpose was both entertainment and terror, and he, Lucius the scribe, had been hired to be its chronicler. The memory of the first day's slaughter was still a raw, unsettled wound in Lucius's mind when he returned to the amphitheater. The sand had been raked clean, but he could still see the phantom stains of the previous afternoon, dark maps of violence etched into the earth. The crowd, however, had no such ghosts. They buzzed with a different, more primal energy, a collective anticipation that crackled through the humid air. Today was the Venatio, the beast hunt, and a new kind of spectacle was promised. Trumpets blared, and a procession of exotic creatures was driven into the arena. A living tapestry of the empire's reach. Lucius's breath caught. There were striped horses from the southern deserts, their long necks craning in confusion. Shaggy bulls, with horns like crescent moons, and leopards whose spotted coats rippled with contained fury as they paced in tight circles, snarling at the walls of noise that confined them. But it was the lions that commanded the space. A dozen of them, males with great manes like sun-bleached halos, were released from their cages. They did not snarl or pace. They simply stood, regal and immense, surveying the madness around them with a terrifying ancient calm. Their presence was a physical weight, a reminder of a wild, untamed world now bent to Rome's cruel will. Then the hunters entered, the bestiari armed with spears and whips. They were not warriors but performers, their movements choreographed to showcase danger without truly embracing it. The hunt began not as a contest, but as a systematic dismantling. The graceful zebras were the first to fall, their striped hides pierced by javelins, their dying kicks throwing up clouds of dust. The great cats, confused and cornered, were goaded into charges that ended on the points of waiting spears. Lucius's stomach turned. He was horrified by the sheer waste of such magnificent life, by the casual cruelty of the slaughter. His stylus hovered over the tablet, his notes faltering. Yet a dark, shameful fascination held him captive. He could not look away from the raw power of a lion's final. A defiant roar, a sound that for a moment drowned out the shrieks of the crowd and vibrated deep in his bones. He watched, mesmerized and appalled, as the last great beast, a male with a gash along its flank, turned to face its tormentors. It was a vision of pure, undiluted fury, a king brought low in a circus of blood. The crowd's roar reached a fever pitch as the final spear found its mark, and the lion collapsed onto the sand it had once ruled. Lucius finally looked down at his tablet, his hand steady now. He had recorded the event, but he knew the numbers and descriptions could never capture the sickening, awe-inspiring spectacle. He had just witnessed the terrible beauty of a world being destroyed for applause. The scent of the beast hunt still hung in the air, a coppery, musky perfume of death that clung to the back of the throat when the gates beneath the imperial box groaned open once more. The crowd's roar, which had subsided into a contented murmur, swelled again with fresh anticipation. This was no parade of exotic animals, no performance by skilled hunters. This was something far more intimate, far more human. A line of figures chained at the ankle and wrist shuffled out onto the sand, blinking in the harsh sunlight like creatures dragged from a deep and forgotten cave. Lucius leaned forward, his scribe's instincts warring with a deep-seated revulsion. These were not warriors or performers, they were simply people, their faces etched with a spectrum of despair that was horrifyingly plain to see. Some wept openly, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Others stared ahead with a hollow, terrifying vacancy, their spirits already broken. A few held their heads high, their jaws set in defiance, their eyes burning with a hatred so pure it seemed to scorch the very air around them. They were a gallery of the damned, a living testament to the Empire's absolute power to punish. From his elevated position, Lucius could hear the heralds announcing the crimes of each condemned soul, their voices booming across the arena to ensure the lesson was not lost on a single spectator. The litany was a chilling descent into the machinery of Roman justice. The first was a gaunt man, accused of stealing a sack of grain to feed his family. Next came a woman, her tunic torn, condemned for speaking ill of her master. Then a group of slaves, their rebellion against a cruel overseer ending here on the bloodied sand. The list continued, a cascade of human failing and desperation, debtors, petty thieves, runaway servants. But the final names drew a different, more sinister reaction from the crowd, a mix of boos and eager bloodlust. These were the political prisoners, men accused of sedition, of questioning the divine right of the emperor. Their crime was not against property, but against power itself. And their punishment was to be the centerpiece of the day's grim entertainment. Lucius's hand moved across the wax, recording each name in charge, but the words felt hollow. He was not cataloging criminals, he was itemizing lives, each one a story of desperation or defiance now being erased for the amusement of Rome. The scale of it settled over him, a cold, heavy dread. This was not justice. This was theater, and the price of admission was a human soul. The first condemned man, the one who had stolen grain, was forced to his knees. Two arena attendants held his arms outstretched as a third approached, not with a sword but with a heavy, blunt mallet. The crowd fell into an anticipatory hush, broken only by the dry rasp of the man's terrified breathing. With a sickening wet crack, the mallet came down on his elbow, shattering the joint. A scream tore from his throat, raw and piercing. But it was swallowed by the sudden eruption of cheers and laughter from the stands. This was not a swift execution. It was a dismantling. Blow after blow fell, systematically breaking bones until the man was a weeping, broken thing left writhing in the sand, a living lesson in the cost of defiance, no matter how small. Next, the woman accused of insolence was brought forward. She was stripped and tied to a wooden post set in the center of the arena. From the opposite gate, a handler emerged, leading a starved, mangy bear on a heavy chain. The beast's eyes were fixed on the helpless woman, its hunger a palpable force. The handler released the chain and retreated. For a long, agonizing moment, the bear simply sniffed the air, circling the post while the woman's whimpers echoed faintly. Then, with a sudden, brutal lunge, it was upon her. The crowd's roar was not one of horror, but of exhilaration, a collective release at the savage spectacle. Lucius's stomach clenched, his stylus freezing above the tablet. He could not record this. He could only watch, trapped in the nightmare, as the lesson was written not in wax, but in blood and viscera. The political prisoners were saved for last, their deaths crafted with a particular, symbolic cruelty. They were forced to don cheap, gilded armor and given wooden swords. From the imperial box, a handful of gladiators, the real ones, were sent out. It was a mock battle, a grotesque parody of military glory. The prisoners, untrained and terrified, were cut down not in combat but in a methodical slaughter, their wooden weapons splintering against real steel. The final rebel, a man who had held his head high in defiance, was disarmed and forced to his knees before the imperial podium. An executioner approached with a heavy axe. The blow was not clean. It took 3 strikes to sever the head fully. The head was then picked up by the hair and paraded around the arena's perimeter, a grisly trophy held aloft for all to see. The message was unmistakable. This was the fate of any who challenged Rome. The sand, once pale, was now a dark, churning mud of blood and earth. The air thrummed with the crowd's approval, a sound more animal than human. Lucius finally looked down at his blank tablet. His duty was to document, to give order to this chaos with words and numbers. But all he could see were the faces, the terror, the defiance, the final, empty stillness. He had come to Rome to record history, but he was chronicling its utter soul-crushing cost. The stench of the arena, thick, cloying mixture of blood, sweat, and animal musk clung to Lucius's tunic and hair long after the last spectator had departed. It was a perfume of death that seemed to have seeped into his very skin, a constant, grim reminder of the horrors he had witnessed from the relative safety of the stands. His assignment the next morning, however, promised no such distance. He was to descend into the bowels of the Flavian amphitheater itself, into the labyrinthine world that powered the spectacle above, and document its logistics, the inventory of lives and limbs, the accounting of carnage. A narrow, steep stairwell led him down from the blinding Roman sun into a realm of perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, damper, thick with the smell of damp stone, stale straw, and something else, a low, collective hum of fear and resignation that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that made the cramped corridors feel alive and predatory. The sounds here were different, too, not the roar of a crowd, but the clank of chains, the murmur of hushed voices, the occasional sob or cough echoing from behind heavy iron-barred doors. These were the holding cells, and Lucius moved past them with a quickened pace, the weight of countless unseen eyes upon him. He found the administrative office tucked into a small, windowless chamber where the torchlight barely reached. Scrolls and wax tablets were stacked haphazardly on a rough-hewn wooden desk, and it was here he was to begin his grim tally. He had only just unrolled his first scroll when a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the quiet, economical grace of a man long accustomed to navigating confined spaces. This was Decimus, the head lanista. His face was a roadmap of old violence, crisscrossed with pale scars that stood out against his leathery, sun-beaten skin. His eyes, however, were his most striking feature. They were the flat, calculating eyes of a man who had long since stopped seeing people and saw only assets and liabilities, combatants and corpses. He looked over Lucius's shoulder at the blank tablet, his expression unreadable. He was the master of this underground kingdom, the man who turned the emperor's condemnations into arena performances. And he regarded the young pale scribe from the provinces with a silent, appraising curiosity that felt more threatening than any open hostility. Lucius had expected Decimus to be a man of boasts, proud of the lethal efficiency of his operation. Instead, the lanista's manner was grim, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the torchlight rather than project through it. He led Lucius deeper into the shadowy underbelly of the arena, away from the administrative nook, toward a section of cells that echoed not with sobs, but with a tense, metallic quiet, the sound of men preparing for combat. Through the bars, Lucius saw figures unlike the professional gladiators he had watched from the stands. These men were leaner, their bodies lacking the sculpted muscle of trained fighters. Their armor was ill-fitting, their helmets crude, and their eyes held not the focused aggression of athletes, but the wide, trapped terror of prey. Decimus stopped before one such cell, his scarred face impassive. He gestured with a calloused hand toward the men inside, who flinched away from his gaze as if struck. His revelation was delivered not as a confession, but as a simple, brutal fact of his trade. He explained that the crowd's beloved spectacle required a constant, renewable source of fighters. Not all who wore the gladiator's harness were trained in the ludi. Many were prisoners of war, captured rebels, or common criminals given a grim choice: die meekly in the morning's executions, or be given a weapon and the faint, cruel illusion of a chance in the afternoon's games. There was no training, no hope of victory or fame. Their fate was sealed the moment they donned the cheap armor. They were sent out against seasoned killers, to die entertainingly, to bleed convincingly, to make the real gladiators look heroic. Their function was to pad the numbers, to extend the spectacle, and to die without costing the game's organizers the time and expense of a proper gladiator's upbringing. It was a secret the crowd never saw from their comfortable seats, the difference between a performer and a sacrifice. Decimus's flat eyes watched Lucius absorb this, seeing the dawning horror on the young scribe's face. This was the machinery of the games laid bare, a system that consumed hope as readily as it consumed lives, grinding both into blood-soaked sand for the pleasure of Rome. The scent of the beast pens was a living thing, a thick, musky fog of straw dung and raw meat that clung to the back of Lucius's throat. It was here, in the cavernous, echoing vaults beneath the arena, that he found the man responsible for the morning's slaughter of lions and leopards. The head bestiarius, a man named Sparius, stood with his arms crossed before a cage containing a pacing tiger, its striped coat rippling with barely contained power. He was a barrel-chested man with a thick neck and hands scarred by claws and teeth, and he regarded the magnificent animal not with fear or awe, but with the proprietary air of a merchant surveying his finest wares. Spurius's pride was a palpable, almost violent force. He launched into a boastful monologue without preamble, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. He spoke of his networks, of agents stationed at the very edges of the empire, the deserts of Africa, the jungles of India, the frozen forests of the north. He described the immense logistical nightmare of capturing a full-grown rhinoceros, building a ship strong enough to transport a bull elephant across the Middle Sea, of keeping a panther alive and furious for the long journey to Rome. Each animal was a trophy, a testament not only to the reach of Rome, but to his own personal cunning and ruthlessness. But his true artistry, he claimed, with a chilling smile, was not in the acquisition, but in the staging. He led Lucius past rows of cages, each containing a different nightmare. He explained his craft with the passion of a playwright discussing his latest drama. He described how a starved bear could be made more aggressive, how a lioness could be driven into a frenzy by separating her from her cubs just before release. He pointed out hidden pits and spring-loaded platforms on a crude sand table model of the arena detailing, how a tiger could be made to appear from nowhere, how a herd of antelope could be funneled directly into the path of waiting spears. His eyes gleamed as he described his greatest triumph, an encounter where a condemned man had been sewn into a freshly killed deer hide and then released among a pack of starving wolves. The crowd, he said, had never roared louder. For Sparius, the animals were not living creatures, but props. The condemned were not people, but plot devices. His masterpiece was death itself, and he signed his work in blood and screams. The arena was no longer an arena. In a feat of engineering that spoke of Rome's boundless ambition and utter disregard for cost, the great basin had been transformed overnight. A network of concealed channels, fed by the Aqua Claudia, had flooded the vast space, turning the blood-soaked sand into a shallow, murky inland sea. Wooden ships, scaled-down replicas of Roman and Carthaginian war galleys, now floated where men and beasts had fought and died just the day before. Their sails were patched and faded, their hulls scarred from previous spectacles. But to the roaring crowd, they were vessels of legend, props in the grandest, most absurd theater of death Lucius had yet witnessed, the Naumachia. Hundreds of men, condemned to this aquatic execution, were forced aboard the ships. They were given oars not to row to freedom, but to maneuver themselves into position for slaughter. They wore the crude armor of historical enemies, their faces pale and dripping with cold water and fear. There was no strategy here, no glorious reenactment of a famous naval victory. There was only chaos, engineered for maximum carnage. At a signal from the imperial box, the ships were driven together, their rams splintering wood with jarring crashes that echoed over the water. The men, most of whom had likely never seen the sea, were thrown into the churning, artificially created waves. What followed was not a battle, but a drowning. Men who could not swim flailed and vanished beneath the surface, their heavy armor pulling them down into the dark water. Others were struck by oars, wielded as clubs, or clumsily thrust with spears, their blood blooming in the water like ghastly flowers. The spectacle was horrifyingly silent compared to the land-based games. The crowd's cheers were muted by the splashing, the gurgled cries, the desperate gasps for air. Lucius's stylus moved mechanically across the wax, his notes a cold ledger of the dying. He recorded the numbers, the types of ships, the estimated count of participants, but his mind was fixed on the individual tragedies playing out in the water below. Man clinging to a broken spar before being pulled under by a rival, another simply surrendering to the water, allowing it to claim him without a fight. The engineered sea became a broth of death, its surface littered with the dead and dying. The lesson of the Nomachia was the most profound yet. Rome would not just kill you on land. It would reshape the very earth, commandeer the sea itself, to find new and spectacular ways for you to die. A hush fell over the Flavian amphitheater, a silence so profound and unnatural, it felt heavier than any roar. The water from the Nomachia had been drained, the wreckage cleared, the sand once more raked into a pale, deceptive innocence. But the air still thrummed with the memory of drowning men, a tension that was suddenly severed by the blare of a single golden trumpet from the imperial podium. All eyes turned upward, where Emperor Commodus stood, not as a passive observer, but clad in the polished, lion-scaled armor of Hercules. He raised a gilded club, and the silence shattered into a wave of confused, then ecstatic adulation. The announcement was not made by a herald, but by the emperor himself, his voice ringing with a performer's projection and a god's presumed authority. He declared that the people of Rome deserved to witness not mere mortal combats, but the divine prowess of their emperor, the son of Jupiter. He, Commodus, would descend into the arena to perform feats of strength and skill for his beloved citizens. The line between ruler and entertainer, between the divine and the grotesque, dissolved in that moment. The crowd's cheers were a mixture of genuine awe, sycophantic fervor, and the sheer thrill of witnessing the ultimate novelty in emperor playing gladiator. Lucius watched, his stylus frozen above his tablet, as Commodus strutted along the sand, basking in the adoration. He was followed by a train of attendants carrying an array of ornate, jewel-encrusted weapons. The performance was a carefully choreographed farce. A series of chained and terrified prisoners, unarmed and shieldless, were prodded into the arena to serve as his opponents. Commodus lunged and thrust with theatrical flair, each movement designed to showcase his form rather than deliver a killing blow. The deaths, when they came, were slow and humiliating, a theatrical beheading here. A drawn-out disemboweling their reach, one met with a thunderous ovation that seemed to fuel the emperor's preening vanity. He was not a warrior, he was an actor on the world's bloodiest stage, and the script demanded a river of real blood to validate his imaginary divinity. Lucius finally forced his hand to move, etching the surreal horror into wax. The absolute power of Rome, embodied in one man, had chosen to express itself not through governance or justice, but through a narcissistic pantomime of death. The emperor's performance left a strange, hollow silence in its wake, the air still vibrating with the dissonance of divine pretense and mortal butchery. For Lucius, the spectacle had shifted something within him, stripping away the last vestiges of morbid fascination and leaving only a cold, clinical dread. His next assignment felt like a descent into the arithmetic of that dread. He was to compile the full accounting of the games, not the glory or the myth, but the raw, unvarnished cost. Secluded in the small administrative office, surrounded by stacks of wax tablets and curling papyrus scrolls, he began to tally the price of Rome's amusement. The numbers were staggering, each figure a world of expense and effort. He started with the beasts. The ledger entries were dry and mercantile, but each line conjured a vivid, tragic image. Asterisk Panthera pardus, 12 cost, 4,000 sesterces each. He saw the leopards, sleek and terrified in their cages. Asterisk Leo, 8. Cost 5,500 sesterces. The great lions, their regal defiance extinguished for a morning's entertainment. Asterisk Tigris, 2. Cost 8,000 sesterces. The tigers from the eastern jungles transported across continents to die in a flooded pit. The sums for their capture, transport, and feeding alone could have fed a provincial town for a year. Then came the props and sets, the timber for the mock ships of the Nomachia, the tons of water diverted from the aqueduct, the elaborate pyres and mechanical traps, the gilded armor for the emperor's pathetic charade. Each item was a monument to wasted wealth, a fortune spent on the orchestration of death. But it was the final column that made his blood run cold: the human cost. The ledgers did not list names, only categories and numbers, reducing lives to inventory. Asterisk, condemned criminals, 120. Condemned rebels, 45. Prisoners of war for Nomachia, 300. Gladiators, trained, 20 gladiators, untrained. Condemned, 60. Asterisk, he did the sums, his stylus scratching the wax with a grim finality. Over 500 souls, 500 stories, 500 families, 500 reasons, all erased in a few days for the roar of the crowd and the vanity of an emperor. He sat back, the weight of the numbers pressing down on him. This was not a game. It was a vast, hungry engine, consuming treasure and lives with an insatiable appetite, and he was the man tasked with counting its teeth. The numbers on the wax tablet were no longer abstract figures. They had weight, breadth, and terror, compelled by the grim arithmetic of his own accounting. Lucius felt a morbid need to attach faces to the sums, to witness the human inventory he had so coldly tallied. With a whispered permission from a disinterested guard, he descended deeper than he ever had before, into the very foundations of the amphitheater, where the cheers from above were nothing but a dull, thunderous rumble, like a distant and angry god. The air grew thick and foul, heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies. Fierce sweat and the faint, metallic tang of old blood that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Torchlight guttered in the oppressive gloom, casting frantic shadows that danced across walls slick with condensation. The corridor was lined with cells, not of stone and iron, but of heavy wooden bars. And from behind them came the sounds of the condemned, the defiant roars of gladiators, but the quiet, desperate sounds of broken people. A low, constant weeping formed a wretched chorus, punctuated by the rattle of chains and the occasional hacking cough that echoed in the damp confines. Lucius moved slowly, his scribe's sandals whispering on the wet stone. He forced himself to look into each cell he passed. In one, a young man, no older than himself, sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In another, a group of huddled figures stared into the middle distance, their eyes vacant and glassy, their spirits already departed for a place far from this earthly hell. Further down, a woman rocked back and forth, clutching a small, crude amulet and whispering a frantic prayer to gods who clearly were not listening here. Their crimes, he knew from his ledgers, were a litany of desperation. Stolen bread, unpaid debts, a moment of foolish defiance against an unjust master. This was the true cost, the currency paid for the spectacle above. These were not warriors seeking glory, but people waiting for their turn to be slaughtered for sport. Their fear was a palpable fog, seeping into Lucius's lungs and clinging to him. He saw a man tracing patterns in the grime on the floor, his movements slow and deliberate. A final, fragile attempt to impose order on the chaos of his fate. In that moment, the grandeur of Rome, the majesty of its laws, and the glory of its games crumbled into dust. All that remained was this underground world of despair, a hidden engine room where human lives were the fuel, and he was merely the clerk who kept the ledger. He turned away the weight of their silent terror, a heavier burden than any tablet he would ever carry. The amphitheater sand had been sculpted into a crude topography of hills and valleys, a child's model of a foreign battlefield. Painted wooden facades stood for fortress walls, and cheap standards bearing unfamiliar symbols fluttered in the breeze. The crowd, still buzzing from the emperor's grotesque performance, leaned forward with a renewed bloodthirsty curiosity. This was to be a reenactment of a famous Roman victory in Germania, a history lesson written in sweat and blood. Trumpets blared a triumphant, if slightly off-key, fanfare, and the players took their positions. From one gate emerged a contingent of men playing the part of the heroic Roman legionaries. They were professional gladiators and a few soldiers from the Praetorian Guard, their armor polished, their movements disciplined and confident. They formed a testudo, their shields locking together into an impregnable shell, a living monument to Roman military might. A swell of patriotic pride roared from the stands. From the opposite gate came their opponents, the Germanic horde. These were the captives Lucius had seen in the cells, the rebels and prisoners of war from the northern frontiers. They were given shaggy animal pelts and crude wooden axes. Their faces, painted with rough stripes, could not conceal the stark terror in their eyes. They were not actors. They were lambs being dressed for a ritual slaughter. The mock battle began with a choreographed clash. The Romans advanced in perfect formation, their mock combat a display of superior technique. The barbarians were meant to break and flee, to be cut down in a glorious rout. But fear is a poor director. Some of the captives, paralyzed by terror, simply stood and were easily dispatched by the blunted training swords of the Romans, falling to the sand in a pantomime of death. Others, driven by a final, desperate surge of survival instinct, forgot the script entirely. They fought back with a raw, frantic ferocity, using their fake axes as clubs, scratching and biting at the polished armor of their opponents. The carefully staged battle descended into a messy, brutal brawl. The crowd loved it, their cheers growing louder at this unexpected taste of real violence. A signal was given from the imperial box. The play was over. The professional fighters immediately disengaged and withdrew to the edges of the arena, their part done. The captives were left standing alone and confused in the center of the vast space, their chests heaving, their makeshift weapons now useless. Then the real executioners emerged. They were not performers, but butchers from the arena's staff, carrying heavy, sharp axes and broadswords. There was no ceremony now, no pretense of drama. The lesson of Roman invincibility was to be sealed in absolute, unforgiving finality. One by one, the men who had played the enemy were forced to their knees. The axes fell with a terrible, wet finality. Heads rolled across the constructed hills and valleys of the fake battlefield, coming to rest in the sand, their sightless eyes staring up at the cheering masses who had just watched a history lesson conclude with a very real, very present massacre. The reenactment was over. The victory was complete. The sand drank deeply once more. As dusk bled into a bruised purple night, the torches around the Flavian amphitheater were lit, their flames casting long, leaping shadows that transformed the great stone bowl into a cavern of flickering demons. The air, still warm from the day's sun, carried a new, acrid scent, the smell of pitch and oil, thick and anticipatory. The day's horrors were not over. They were merely shifting into a more theatrical, more sinister key. The crowd, their faces painted in the ghoulish light, buzzed with a different energy, a carnival hunger for the spectacle promised under the stars. The fire dance. From the depths of the hypogeum, a procession emerged, moving with a slow, shuffling dread that was palpable even from the highest tiers. A dozen condemned men and women were driven onto the sand, but they were no longer recognizable as human. They had been costumed in grotesque parody. Some wore stiff, elaborate tunics, stitched with feathers and rags to mimic birds. Others were draped in voluminous sacks, painted with monstrous, leering faces. Each costume was a masterpiece of cruelty, soaked through with flammable resins and oils that gleamed slickly in the torchlight, their pungent odor cutting through the night air. The prisoners stumbled, their movements stiff and disoriented, blinded by oversized masks and weighed down by their own impending immolation. A hush fell, a collective intake of breath. Then, at a signal unseen, attendants with long-lit brands stepped forward from the shadows. They did not rush. Their movements were ritualistic, deliberate, as they touched the flames to the hem of a feathered tunic, the sleeve of a monstrous robe. The fire did not catch slowly, erupted. With a soft, breathy whoosh, the first prisoner became a pillar of flame. A shrieking torch that illuminated the entire arena in a sudden, horrifying burst of light. The scream was unlike any Lucius had heard before, a raw animal sound of pure, unimaginable agony. It was joined by another, and then another, as the brands found their marks. The sand became a floor of hell. Human torches staggered and spun in a macabre ballet, their movements fueled by an instinct to flee a pain that was now inseparable from their own bodies. The crowd's reaction was a roaring wave of awe and terror and delight, a sound that seemed to feed the very flames. Some of the burning figures fell quickly, curling into silent, smoking pyres. Others ran in blind, screaming circles, their fiery costumes leaving trails of light and smoke against the dark sand. A grotesque dance of death that held the audience in rapt, horrified thrall. Lucius watched, his throat tight, his stylus forgotten. He could not record this. There were no numbers for this, no words in any language that could capture the sight of a human being transformed into a brief, screaming candle, their life extinguished, not for justice, not for punishment, but for a night's entertainment under the cold, indifferent stars. The fire dance was not an execution. It was a sacrifice to the crowd's bottomless appetite for novelty. A warning written in fire and flesh that the Empire's creativity for cruelty knew no bounds. The charred, smoking remains of the fire dance were cleared away with a grim efficiency. The sand beneath them now a permanent ashen black. But the crowd's thirst was far from slaked. If anything, the scent of burned flesh, the air itself seemed to hum with a low, predatory expectation. From the imperial box, a single sharp gesture from the emperor's hand signaled the beginning of a new horror, one that traded fire for velocity, immolation for dismemberment. The chariot of death was to be the afternoon's gruesome centerpiece. And 4 chariots, stripped of any ornamentation save for the cruel purpose they served, rattled out onto the sand. They were light, skeletal things, built for speed and maneuverability, each pulled by a team of 2 powerful horses whose hides were already lathered with nervous sweat. Tied by long, coarse ropes to the back of each chariot was a human being. The prisoners, a mix of men and women, were bound at the ankles, their wrists tied behind their backs, leaving them utterly helpless. They were dragged forward a few stumbling steps before collapsing onto the abrasive sand, their faces masks of pure primal terror as they stared at the immense, uncaring crowd in the vast stretch of arena that was to be their killing ground. The charioteers, masked and anonymous, cracked their whips. The spectacle was not a race, but a prolonged, methodical execution. The initial lurch of the chariots yanked the prisoners off their feet, sending them skidding and bouncing across the sand like discarded dolls. The crowd's roar was instantaneous, a wave of sound that seemed to push the chariots faster. The first pass was relatively clean, a brutal dragging that tore clothing and scraped skin raw against the unforgiving ground. But the purpose was not mere abrasion. The charioteers began to steer in wide, dizzying circles, crossing each other's paths, ensuring the ropes and the bodies attached to them became tangled and confused. The velocity and the friction did the work of any blade. Would snap with a sound that was lost to the crowd, as frenzy but visible in the sudden, awful jerk and the spray of crimson that followed. The sand was soon streaked with long red arcs and littered with grotesque separated parts. One chariot dragged a now limp body that was missing a leg. Another left a trail of a single arm still bound at the wrist, bouncing grotesquely in its wake. The prisoners who remained somewhat intact were reduced to screaming bloody things, their humanity erased by the relentless, grinding violence. The charioteers showed no emotion, their focus entirely on maintaining the deadly pace and pattern, their whips cracking in time with the crowd's roaring approval. It was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated physics, a lesson in how easily a human body could be unraveled by speed and stone. All for the delight of an empire that had long since stopped seeing the difference between a person and a plaything. The sand, still damp and stained from the morning's horrors, was once again raked into a deceptive smoothness, a blank page awaiting a new and more extravagant script of death. The lingering scent of blood and smoke was overpowered by a new, musky wave of animal fear, as the gates to the beast pens groaned open. Today's Venatio was promised to be unlike any before, a testament to the Beastmaster Spurius's twisted artistry and the Empire's bottomless resources. The crowd, still buzzing from the visceral thrill of the chariots, leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with anticipation for the exotic slaughter to come. First came the giraffe, a creature of such impossible elegance. It seemed a visitor from a myth. Its long, slender neck swayed with a gentle, bewildered grace as it was prodded into the center of the arena. Spotted and tremulous, it blinked its large, liquid eyes at the roaring multitude, a living sculpture of gentle confusion. The hunters did not attack immediately. They allowed the crowd to marvel at its strangeness, to absorb the sheer improbability of its presence. Then, with a signal, the javelins flew. They were not aimed to kill quickly, but to maim and terrify. One struck its flank, causing the great beast to stagger and let out a soft, bleating cry of shock. Another pierced its long neck. It stumbled in a clumsy, heartbreaking circle, its legs folding unnaturally beneath it until it collapsed. A fallen monument to a world Rome was determined to conquer and destroy. Before the giraffe had stilled, a new gate crashed open, and a streak of orange and black exploded onto the sand. A Bengal tiger, its coat a vibrant map of fury, launched itself into the arena with a roar that shook the very bones of the spectators. This was no confused lion from the emperor's menagerie. This was a prime specimen, all coiled muscle and primal rage. The hunters, now armed with long spears and heavy shields, formed a practiced semicircle. The hunt was a deadly dance, choreographed to showcase the tiger's terrifying power while ensuring its inevitable demise. It charged, a blur of lethal intent, its claws scraping against raised shields, its jaws snapping a hair's breadth from a hunter's face. Each near miss drew gasps and cheers. The beast was magnificent in its fury, a true king of its own realm, now reduced to a performer in a Colosseum of death. But the finale was Spurious's true masterpiece. From a hidden trapdoor in the sand, a platform rose, bearing a bound and helpless prisoner, a single man offered as a living sacrifice. Simultaneously, a second tiger was released from across the arena. The two great cats, confused and enraged, ignored the hunters and focused on the easier, helpless prey. They converged on the platform in a terrifying display of instinct and power. A brutal tug-of-war over the screaming man that ended not with a clean kill, but with a grisly rending that painted the sand crimson. The crowd erupted in a frenzy of approval at the novelty, the complexity, the sheer theatrical cruelty of it. Lucius watched, his notes abandoned, as the last tiger was finally brought down by a forest of spears. The beast hunt had intensified, evolving from a simple slaughter into a dark and elaborate theater, each death more staged, more inventive, and more soul-crushing than the last. The roar of the crowd was no longer a simple sound. It had become a living entity, a many-throated beast that thrived on a diet of blood and novelty. Lucius, perched in his scribe's alcove, watched it as intently as he watched the horrors unfolding on the sand below. I had learned to read its moods, its cadences, its insatiable desires. The polite applause for a clean, swift kill had vanished weeks ago, replaced by a restless, simmering energy that demanded more. The executions, the hunts, the mock battles, they were no longer enough. The beast was hungry, and its hunger was growing. He saw it in the faces around him. Where once there had been shock or morbid fascination, there was now a glazed, anticipatory look. Spectators no longer flinched at the spray of blood. They leaned forward, their eyes searching for a more creative angle of dismemberment, a more prolonged scream of agony. A simple beheading now earned bored murmurs and scattered applause. A straightforward animal mauling was met with impatient chatter until the next more novel event was announced. The crowd's thirst had been whetted, not quenched, by the river of blood that flowed daily onto the sand, and now it demanded ever stronger vintages of cruelty. The game's organizers, masters of this dark economy, were all too happy to oblige. Lucius saw the pattern in the ledgers, in the whispered conversations between Decimus and the Beastmaster. The executions grew more elaborate, the hunts more theatrical, the methods of death more baroque. It was a vicious, escalating cycle. The crowd's roared approval for a particularly gruesome death became the benchmark, the new minimum requirement for the next spectacle. Failure to meet it resulted in a restless, dissatisfied rumble that could quickly turn to boos and throne refuse, a dire threat to those whose livelihoods and lives depended on imperial favor. The crowd, once spectators, had become the silent directors of the carnage. Their collective appetite the most powerful force in the arena, more demanding than any emperor's whim. They were being transformed, day by bloody day, and in turn, they were transforming Rome itself into a mirror of their own desensitized cruelty. Lucius documented it all, each entry in his ledger a testament not just to a death but to the erosion of the city's soul. A new kind of silence fell over the Flavian amphitheater, one not of anticipation for blood sport but of collective stunned recognition. The man paraded onto the sand was not a common criminal, a captured rebel, or a terrified slave. He was Gaius Fabius, a Stoic philosopher known throughout Rome for his public lectures in the Forum. A man whose only crime was the quiet, reasoned criticism of the emperor's excesses. Dressed not in rags, but in his simple, worn philosopher's robe, he walked with a dignity that seemed to shame the very sand he trod upon. His hands were bound, but his back was straight, his gaze clear and unwavering as it swept across the tears of his fellow citizens. The crowd's roar faltered, replaced by a confused murmur. This was different. This was not justice. It was a message, delivered in the form of a respected silver-haired teacher. The execution was not delegated to common bestiary or executioners. From the imperial box descended a figure clad in the pristine, ceremonial armor of the Praetorian Guard, his face a cold, impassive mask. This was no mere killing. It was a state-sanctioned murder, a performance of absolute power designed to quash not just a man, but an idea. Fabius was forced to his knees, but he did not bow his head. He looked toward the emperor's box, and though no words passed his lips, his defiance was a louder proclamation than any herald's cry. The crowd held its breath, the air thick with a tension that had nothing to do with sport. The Praetorian's blade was swift and precise. There was no theatrical flourish, no prolonged suffering. It was a single, clean stroke that severed the philosopher's head from his body with a grim, surgical finality. The head dropped to the sand, the eyes still open, still seemingly fixed on Commodus. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the drip of blood onto the thirsty ground. Then, a herald's voice boomed across the arena, explaining the lesson. This was the fate of treason, of disloyalty, of a tongue that dared to question divinity. The philosopher's body was left there, a stark, bloody monument to the price of free thought. The crowd did not cheer. They watched in a hushed, uneasy quiet, the spectacle's usual bloodlust replaced by a cold, creeping fear. The games had always been a weapon against Rome's enemies. Now, they had been turned inward, and every citizen in the stands understood that they too could become part of the lesson. Beneath the roar of the crowd and the clash of arms on the arena floor, a different, far more desperate sound was being forged. In the dim, suffocating confines of the gladiator's holding cell, the air was thick, not just with the stench of fear, but with the sharp metallic tang of rebellion. A dozen men, the forced fighters Decimus had spoken of, huddled together. Their ill-fitting armor felt like tombs, their poorly balanced swords like cruel jokes. But tonight the jokes had a bitter, lethal edge. Their leader was a man named Kratos, a captured rebel from the northern frontier, whose body was a roadmap of old scars, and whose eyes held a fire that not even the arena could extinguish.
Ow.
The plan was a fragile, desperate thing, born of whispered conversations in the dead of night and passed between cells with the rations. It hinged on chaos, on the one moment when the meticulously ordered world of the games was at its most vulnerable. The Grand Melee, a scheduled event where dozens of gladiators, both trained and condemned, would be released into the arena at once for a chaotic freefall. In that swirling storm of combat, amidst the distraction of clashing steel and roaring spectators, they would make their move. Their objective was not to win the melee, but to break from its script entirely. They would turn their weapons not on each other, but on the guards stationed at the arena's edge. They'd fighting their way toward one of the smaller service gates that led out into the labyrinth beneath the stands. Kratos moved among them now, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in the oppressive air. He assigned roles with the grim efficiency of a man who knew this was their only chance, however slim. Two brothers from Thrace, powerful and quick, would lead the initial charge toward the guards. A wiry, silent man from Alexandria, who had been an acrobat before his capture, would scale the low wall of the arena to create a distraction. Others were tasked with forming a protective wedge, a moving wall of desperate men. They knew the odds. They knew the Praetorian Guard waited beyond the arena walls, that the city itself was a gilded cage. But the certainty of a staged death in the sand was a far greater terror than the uncertainty of a fight for freedom. They would rather die on their feet, weapons in hand, facing their true captors, than on their knees for the amusement of Rome. As the sound of trumpets signaled the start of the afternoon's events, they shared a final, grim look. Theirs was not a hope for escape, but a pact for a defiant end. The rebellion would be a brief, bright flame, but it would be theirs. The rebellion was a brief, bright flame. And Rome was a world built to smother such sparks with absolute, brutal finality. The initial surge of desperate men, their makeshift weapons raised not against each other, but toward the guards at the arena's edge, was met not with confusion, but with a cold, preordained response. The chaos of the melee, which the rebels had hoped to use as cover, was simply incorporated into the spectacle. The crowd, at first bewildered by the break-in script, quickly roared its approval, mistaking the desperate bid for freedom for a thrilling new narrative of treachery and its suppression. The Praetorians stationed around the arena's perimeter did not break formation. They simply lowered their spears, creating an impenetrable wall of sharpened steel. The rebels' charge shattered against it. Kratos, the rebel leader, was the first to fall, a spear piercing his throat before he could even swing his sword. His death was not heroic. It was efficient, a clinical removal of the infection. The Thracian brothers fought back to back with a ferocity born of utter despair, but they were untrained and outmatched. They were cut down by precise professional strokes, their blood adding to the very sand they had sought to escape. Within moments, the rebellion was crushed. The surviving handful of men, disarmed and beaten, were forced to their knees in the center of the arena, surrounded by the bodies of their comrades. The crowd's cheers reached a fever pitch, not for their bravery, but for their defeat. The lesson was the point. The emperor himself rose from his podium, his face a mask of cold fury at this interruption of his entertainment. His verdict was delivered not with words, but with a single slashing gesture of his thumb. The punishment for rebellion would be memorable. The executions that followed were not merely deaths. They were statements carved into living flesh. One man was sewn into the fresh hide of a dead bull, his head left exposed. Starved dogs were set upon him, and the crowd howled with laughter as he stumbled blindly, the stiffening hide becoming his coffin, until the animals finally found their way in. Another was crucified upside down on a hastily erected cross. Slow suffocation, a gruesome spectacle that lasted until the games ended for the day. A third was given to the arena's carpenters, who methodically broke every bone in his body with hammers, leaving him a twitching, mewling heap upon the sanda, living lesson in the cost of defiance. Each death was designed to be slower, more inventive, and more horrifying than the last, a bloody crescendo of imperial power reaffirmed. The sand, once a symbol of combat, was now a butcher's block. And the message was clear for any who might later dream of freedom. The empire's creativity for cruelty would always outmatch their desperation. The air in the Flavian amphitheater crackled with a familiar, bloodthirsty energy, thick with the scent of sweat and anticipation. Below, the beastmaster Sparius had prepared his most ambitious hunt yet, contained chaos of leopards, wolves, and a single, massive brown bear, all to be released into an arena studded with fake trees and rocky outcrops. The crowd leaned forward, eager for the carefully orchestrated slaughter. But chaos, once summoned, is a fickle servant. As the heavy wooden gate to the main beast's pen began to rise, a stressed oxen, part of the hidden pulley system deep in the hypogeum, panicked at the scent of predator. It bucked against its harness, and with a sound like thunder, the mechanism jammed, then snapped. The gate did not rise smoothly to its predetermined height. It shuddered, jerked upward a few feet, and then crashed back down, its bottom edge splintering against the stone threshold. The gap was just enough. A leopard, all coiled tension and instinct, saw not a barrier but an opening. It shot through the narrow space in a fluid spotted streak. The wolves, driven by pack frenzy, scrambled after it. The great bear, confused and enraged by the noise and the sudden freedom of its cellmates, lowered its head and charged the weakened gate itself, which shattered. The beast, a mountain of fur and fury, was suddenly, terrifyingly loose in the arena's service corridor. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the first scream echoed from the stands near the arena walla high, pure note of terror that cut through the crowd's hum. The leopard, having scaled the low barrier with effortless grace, now stood among the spectators in the first tier. It moved with a predator's disorienting speed, a flash of teeth and claws in the midst of pastel-colored tunics. Panic was not a wave. It was an explosion. The crowd, which had moments before been a unified entity roaring for death, shattered into 1,000 screaming fragments. People scrambled over benches, trampling each other in a blind rush to escape. The wolves, following the leopard's path, added their snapping jaws to the chaos. But the true embodiment of the mutiny was the bear. It had not scaled the wall. It had found an open archway leading into the vaulted passages beneath the seating, the very arteries that fed the amphitheater with spectators. Now it rampaged through these confined spaces, a force of nature unleashed in a man-made labyrinth. Its roars echoed monstrously off the stone, a sound that promised indiscriminate, crushing death. The Praetorian Guard, so adept at controlling unarmed prisoners and staged rebellions, was utterly unprepared for this. Their formations broke as they tried to corner the beast, their spears seeming pitifully small against its raw power. From his alcove, Lucius watched the flawless machinery of Roman control come utterly undone. The sand, the stage for so much directed violence, was now empty. The real spectacle, the true and unpredictable face of death, was happening in the stands. The crowd's hunger for violence had been answered, but not in the way they had desired. They had come to see danger orchestrated and contained for their amusement. And instead they had been reminded that control is a fragile illusion. The empire could command the waves, flood an arena, and command the deaths of thousands, but it could not tame the primal wildness it so loved to exploit. The animal mutiny was a brief, bloody carnival of chaos, and its lesson was written not in the blood of the condemned, but in the terror of the citizens themselves. The chaos of the animal mutiny had been brutally suppressed. The dead spectators and slain beasts cleared away with a grim efficiency that spoke of Rome's desire to forget its own vulnerability. But the memory of that terror lingered in the air, a faint, sour note beneath the usual sense of perfume and sweat. It was into this unsettled atmosphere that Emperor Commodus chose to make his return. The crowd, still jittery, needed a reminder of order, of power, of divinity made manifest. And Commodus, ever the narcissist, was more than willing to provide it, not as a statesman, but as a performer on the blood-stained sand. He descended into the arena, not as a ruler, but as a demigod. His armor was a masterpiece of gilded hubris, sculpted muscle cuirass, and a lion-skin headdress that declared him the new Hercules. In his hand, he carried not a sword of war, but a jeweled theatrical scimitar, a prop for the pantomime to come. The crowd's applause was deafening, a mixture of genuine relief, sycophantic fervor, and the desperate need to believe in the invincibility he projected. He strutted before them, basking in their adoration, a sun around which their fear and hope now orbited. Then the sacrifices were brought forth. They were not gladiators, not rebels, not even trained beasts. They were a handful of the weakest, most broken prisoners from the deepest cells, starving wretches, old men, a youth trembling with fever. They were given no weapons, no shields, not even the pretense of a chance. Their role was to stand, to tremble, and to die convincingly for their god-emperor. Commodus moved among them with the exaggerated grace of a dancer, each swing of his blade a performance of strength and precision. A slow, theatrical beheading here, a carefully placed thrust there each kill was met with a thunderous ovation that seemed to fuel his preening vanity. He was not fighting. He was conducting a symphony of subjugation with human lives as his instruments. After the last body crumpled to the sand, Commodus stood alone amidst the carnage, chest heaving not from exertion but from the ecstasy of the crowd's worship. He raised his arms, and the gilded armor shone in the sun, splattered with the blood of the helpless. He declared himself victor, the unconquerable Hercules, beloved of Jupiter. And the crowd roared its agreement, their earlier fear forgotten in this spectacle of absolute, unchallengeable power. It was the most rigged match in the history of the arena, a fraud performed on a scale so grand, it became truth in the eyes of those who needed to believe. The emperor was not a man, it was a fantasy of invincibility. And the price of maintaining that fantasy was a river of blood from the most defenseless of his subjects. Beneath the roar of the crowd and the emperor's posturing, beneath the very sand stained with the blood of his performances, lay the true architect of the arena's horrors. Lucius was led to him through a warren of narrow, grease-stained passages that smelled of heated metal. Sawdust and ozoned, the scent of invention pressed into the service of death. This was the domain of the arena's chief engineer, a man named Caius, and his workshop was a cluttered, shadowy cavern that felt like the fevered dream of a mad god. Caius himself was a man of wiry intensity, his fingers permanently stained with ink and oil, his eyes bright with a restless, calculating energy that seemed to take in the world not as it was, but as a series of problems to be solved with levers, counterweights, and pivots. He moved through the chaos of his workshop with a predator's grace, brushing past half-assembled contraptions of wood and iron that looked like instruments of torture awaiting their final polish. He did not boast like the Beastmaster or brood like the Lanista. He explained his work with the cold, dispassionate precision of a geometer describing a theorem. He showed Lucius his designs, unrolling schematics on a workbench scarred by chisels and hot coals. The drawings were things of macabre beauty, intricate cross-sections of the arena floor that revealed a hidden world of death. There were plans for spring-loaded spikes that could erupt from the sand to impale a condemned man from below. Diagrams for collapsing floors that would drop victims into pits of starving animals. Elaborate pulley systems designed to hoist prisoners into the air, recreating the myth of Icarus for a fatal, crowd-pleasing finale. His voice was calm, almost reverent, as he described the mechanics of a trap that would release a swinging blade timed to decapitate a man at the climax of a mock trial. His masterpiece, he explained, pointing to a complex model on a central table, was the labyrinth, a series of rotating walls and sections of the arena floor that could be reconfigured between events, creating a shifting maze for prisoners to be hunted in. He spoke of timing, of surprise, of maximizing terror and spectacle through perfectly engineered chaos. For Caius, the screams of the dying were not sounds of agony. They were the desired result of a calculation correctly performed, the proof of his genius. He was the unseen playwright, and every gasp from the crowd, every jolt of fear on the sand, was a line of his dialogue delivered perfectly. His was the ultimate nightmare, a mind of brilliant, meticulous creativity devoted solely to the invention of new and ever more terrible ways for human beings to die. The final roar of the crowd faded, not into silence, but into a ringing, hollow quiet that felt heavier than any noise. The last body had been dragged through the gate of death. The last triumphant gladiator had acknowledged the emperor's whim, and the vast, tiered bowl of the Flavian amphitheater began to empty. The spectators, their thirst for violence temporarily sated, flowed out into the Roman afternoon, their chatter already shifting to dinners and business, the horrors they had witnessed neatly compartmentalized and left behind on the sand. But for Lucius, the spectacle was not over. His duty demanded he descend into the quiet aftermath, to walk the stage after the actors and the blood had been cleared, and to take the final measure of the day's waste. The air in the arena was thick and still, a cloying mixture of dust, spilled wine, and the unmistakable, metallic temps of fresh blood. The sand, once a uniform pale yellow, was now a chaotic map of dark-soaked patches, churned into a gritty mud by countless feet and falling bodies. Lucius's sandals sank into it with a soft, sucking sound, each step a small violation of the sacred space of combat. He moved slowly, his wax tablet held loosely at his side, his stylus forgotten. There was nothing left to record here that numbers could capture. His eyes traced the patterns of struggle and finality written in the earth, a long, dark smear where a man had been dragged away. There, a congealing pool where a life had poured out in seconds. Scattered around were the forgotten detritus of the spectacle. A splintered wooden sword, a torn strip of feathered costume from the fire dance, a single discarded sandal. He stopped near the center, where the political prisoner had met his end. The sand was darkest there, a stark, almost black circle that seemed to absorb the fading sunlight. He thought of the philosopher's calm defiance, the clean efficiency of the stroke, and the way the crowd's silence had been the most terrifying sound of all. He continued his grim patrol, his gaze falling on the mangled remains of a tiger, left for the cleanup crews. Flies already buzzed in a thick cloud around its magnificent, lifeless form, their hum the only sound in the vast space. Further on, the wheel ruts from the chariot of death were still visible, cutting deep grooves through the crimson-stained sand, a permanent record of the velocity of dismemberment. Each detail was a hammer blow against his spirit, a reminder of the immense, carefully orchestrated effort the captured beasts, the transported prisoners, the engineered traps all expended for a few hours of transient, brutal entertainment. He finally reached the gate of life, where the victorious gladiators had exited. The sand here was churned by their triumphant steps, but it was no less bloody. There was no clean division between winner and loser in the arena's stomach. All were digested by the same sand. Lucius looked up at the endless rows of empty seats rising toward the sky. They were like the tears of a vast, silent jury that had just condemned hundreds to death and then gone home for supper. The grandeur of the architecture, the sheer scale of the empire's achievement, now felt like a monstrous joke. This was not a monument to civilization, but a beautifully constructed abattoir. The games were over, but the horror remained, soaked into the very earth. And Lucius was alone with its quiet, deafening testimony. He had come to document history, but he was merely chronicling the endless, repetitive aftermath of Rome's soul dying day by day on the blood-soaked sand. The air in the imperial box was thick with the cloying scent of expensive perfumes and chilled wine, a stark contrast to the familiar reek of blood and sand that rose from the arena floor below. Lucius had been summoned from his scribe's alcove to a plush seat among the shadows of the podium. His presence required not to record the spectacle for Roman archives, but to witness its effect on a very specific audience. Flanking the emperor's empty golden throne were the foreign dignitaries, a somber, silk-clad cluster of men from the recently conquered eastern territories. Their faces, carefully composed into masks of diplomatic neutrality, could not entirely conceal the tension in their jaws or the dread in their eyes. They were guests of honor in name only. In truth, they were captives of a more subtle kind, brought here to watch a play performed for an audience of one, themselves. The games that day were curated with a chilling specificity. The executions were not of common criminals, but of captured officers from their own homelands, men who had once commanded their armies and now stumbled onto the sand in chains. The beast hunt featured animals native to their conquered plains, and mountain-striped horses, and shaggy, long-horned bulls, slaughtered with methodical precision. Each death was a parable, each spray of blood a punctuation mark in the sermon being preached from the imperial box. The message was not subtle. This is the fate of rebellion. This is the end of those who dare defy Rome. Look upon the might that breaks your proudest warriors and your most magnificent beasts, and know your place. Lucius watched the diplomats closely. He saw the way one man's hand tightened around his ivory cup until his knuckles turned white as a spear found its mark in the heart of a man who might have been his cousin. He saw another avert his eyes entirely, staring at the intricate mosaic floor as the crowd roared its approval at the death of a famed regional hero. Their powerlessness was a palpable force in the box, a heavier presence than the emperor himself. They were meant to see not just the brutality, but the ease with which it was delivered, the casual abundance of lives and treasures Rome could expend to make a point. They were being broken not with chains and whips, but with a meticulously crafted display of absolute, effortless dominance. By the time the final body was dragged from the sand, the lesson was etched not in wax, but in the silent, terrified resignation on the faces of the conquered. They would return to their lands not as rulers, but as overseers for a master who had shown them, in the most graphic terms imaginable, the cost of defiance. The stench of the arena was a ghost that followed Lucius through the city, a phantom odor of blood and terror that clung to his clothes and haunted his every breath. It was this invisible taint that seemed to guide him days after the games had concluded. To a different part of Rome altogether, warren of cramped, leaning tenements where the air smelled of cheap wine, boiled lentils, and despair. Here, far from the marble and spectacle, the true cost of the arena was measured not in sesterces, but in silent, suffocating grief. He had come seeking the families of the condemned not as a scribe on official duty, but as a man drowning in the horror of his own ledgers, desperate to attach human faces to the grim inventory of the dead. He found them in dim, airless rooms, their homes marked by a peculiar, hollow silence. The first was a woman, her face etched with lines far too deep for her years, sitting motionless on a stool before a cold hearth. In her lap she clutched a small wooden carving of a songbird, her thumb tracing the same spot on its wing over and over again. Her son, she explained in a voice stripped of all emotion, had been a carpenter's apprentice. He had taken a handful of copper coins from his master Estel to buy medicine for his feverish sister. The master had shown no mercy. The boy's name had been added to the ledger, his life erased for a handful of coins. She had been forced to watch from the cheap seats high in the amphitheater's upper tiers, a single face in a roaring multitude as her child was torn apart by dogs for the crime of desperation. Her grief was not a storm, but a vast frozen sea, and Lucius felt himself freezing within it. In another room, an old man, his hands trembling with a palsy that had nothing to do with age, stared at a crack in the wall. His daughter, a spirited girl with a sharp tongue, had spoken back to the wife of a powerful senator. The accusation of insolence had been a death sentence. The old man described in a broken whisper the fire dance. He had seen the torch touch the hem of her costume, had seen her become a shrieking pillar of flame. He imitated the sound. She made a short, choked gasp before his voice failed him entirely. His powerlessness was a physical weight in the room, a crushing force that had stooped his shoulders and extinguished the light in his eyes. He had been a citizen of Rome his entire life, and the state he had trusted had burned his child alive for entertainment. Lucius moved from one suffocating home to another. Each visit a descent into a new circle of a private hell. Young wife, her face pale and waxy, rocked an empty cradle. Her husband, a captured sailor forced into the Naumachia, had drowned in the manufactured sea while she watched, helpless. A brother showed Lucius the crude, cherished drawings his sibling had made in the dust of their cell, before being taken to the chariot of death. Each story was a world of love and memory annihilated, a personal universe extinguished to pad the numbers of a spectacle. Their anguish was a quiet, desperate counterpoint to the crowd's roar, a truth that existed in the shadows, ignored by the glorious narrative of imperial power. They had no recourse, no appeal, no hope for justice. Their only role was to grieve in silence, their loss just another line item in the vast, bloody accounting of the games. Lucius left the tenement district with the weight of their silent sorrows settled upon him, a burden far heavier than any ledger. He had recorded the empire's brutality, but it was in these dim, grieving rooms that he finally understood its true soul-crushing price. The thirst for novelty had become an unquenchable fire in the belly of Rome, and the games master stoked it with ever more baroque and cruel inventions. The simple sword and beast were no longer enough. The crowd now craved allegory, a story to justify the slaughter. Thus was born the most twisted spectacle yet. The condemned were no longer mere criminals to be executed, but actors in a fatal pantomime. Forced to reenact the tragic myths of gods and heroes, their deaths, the final bloody curtain call. The first to be summoned was a young man, thin and pale from his months in the cells. His crime was unknown, his identity irrelevant. Today he was Icarus. Rough, makeshift wings of wood and wax-soaked cloth were strapped to his arms, a grotesque parody of ambition. He was prodded toward a towering wooden platform constructed in the center of the arena, a stand-in for the sun itself. The crowd watched, murmuring with curiosity, as he was forced to climb the rickety structure, his movements clumsy and terrified. At the top he stood silhouetted against the bright sky, a fragile, human-shaped moth. For a moment there was only the wind and his visible trembling. Then, at a signal from the imperial box, hidden braziers were tipped, directing a blast of superheated air and embers toward the wax on his wings. They did not melt slowly. They erupted into flame. The crowd gasped, as one a sound of pure theatrical delight as the boy. Icarus, consumed by fire, tumbled from his great height, his scream a brief dying siren that was cut off by the wet final thud of his body meeting the sand. No sooner had the smoke cleared than the next myth began. A powerful man, a captured warrior, was dragged forth to play the role of Prometheus. He was chained to a rock, his chest bared. An actor dressed as a majestic eagle in reality, a bestiarius with a cruel, hooked blade, approached. But there was no liver to feast upon for eternity. Punishment was condensed into a single horrific moment. The blade did not tear, it plunged, and the warrior's roar of agony was the eagle's triumphant screech, a brutal simplification of eternal torment for an audience with no patience for eternity. The myths came in a bloody parade. A woman became Dirce, tied to the horns of an enraged bull that dragged her lifeless form in dizzying circles, until it was little more than a bloody rag. A group of prisoners were dressed as satyrs and maenads, given poisoned wine to drink, and left to convulse and die in a staged bacchanal of agony. Each story was stripped of its meaning, its moral, its humanity, until all that remained was the fatal climax. A death foretold by the poets and now made real for the baying crowd. The sand became a stage for a perverted Olympus, where the gods were the crowd, their whims were law. And the only lesson was the absolute theatrical power of Rome to rewrite any story, even the most sacred, into a snuff play for its own amusement. Lucius recorded the titles of the myths, the methods of execution, but the words blurred before his eyes. He was not chronicling stories. He was cataloging the final, utter debasement of art and meaning, a civilization that had begun to consume its own myths and found them delicious. The confession did not come in a moment of drunken camaraderie or shared despair. It arrived in the cold, pragmatic silence of the Lanista's underground office, amidst the scrolls that catalogued the doomed. Lucius had been reviewing the inventory for the next day's games, his stylus pausing over the entry for a new batch of untrained fighters *. Gladiators condemned, 35 *. When Decimus spoke, T's voice was the same low, gravelly rumble he used to discuss rations or equipment, utterly devoid of emotion, which made the words themselves all the more devastating. He spoke of a rebellion to decades past, in a northern province, whose name meant nothing to Lucius. He had been a young tribesman then, fierce and proud, captured with a spear still in his hand. The choice given to him and his comrades was the same one he now offered to others: the quick, anonymous death of the morning executions, or the faint, cruel hope of the afternoon's arena. He had chosen the arena. He described the feel of the cheap, ill-fitting helmet, the weight of the poorly balanced sword, the paralyzing terror of being shoved into the blinding light to face a laughing, seasoned killer. He had not fought with skill, but with the raw, desperate fury of a cornered animal. And he had survived. Not through valor, but through a combination of luck, brutality, and the crowd's fleeting favor. He had killed his opponent, a man just as terrified as he was. And the roar that followed was a drug that flooded his veins, washing away the tribesman he had been. In that moment, he understood the true nature of the arena's power. It did not break everyone. It remade some in its own image. The Romans, impressed by his savage endurance, offered him a new choice: die in the next match or join them. He became a trainable beast, then a guard, then a foreman, and finally the master of the very machine that had almost devoured him. He learned its gears and levers, its economics, and its politics. He learned that survival was not about defiance, but about compliance. To rebel was to be crushed. To serve was to wield a fraction of the power that had once held him captive. He looked at Lucius then, his flat, scarred face illuminated by the single oil lamp on the desk. There was no shame in his gaze, no pride, only a cold, brutal logic. The system was a wheel, immense and unstoppable. One could be ground beneath it, or one could place one's hand upon it and help turn it. He had chosen to turn it. The men and women in the cells were not victims to him. They were the raw material of the spectacle, the necessary fuel. His own past was not a source of empathy, but a textbook on how to manage the condemned. He knew their fears, their desperation, their fleeting hopes, because he had once embodied them. This knowledge made him exceptionally good at his job. He was the perfect guardian of the slaughterhouse, because he had once been led to the knife himself. His was the ultimate betrayal, not of a person, but of his own past suffering, which he now perpetuated with a cold, efficient expertise. He had not escaped the arena. He had become its most loyal and terrifying citizen. The hunger for novelty had become a ravenous beast, and Sparius, the beastmaster, was its most devoted servant. The simple release of a starved predator was now considered quaint, a relic of a less imaginative age. The crowd's jaded palate demanded a sharper spice, a more prolonged and agonizing crescendo to the hunt. Spurius's answer was not found in the size or ferocity of a new animal, but in the subtle, insidious art of venom. His latest spectacle was a masterpiece of twisted ingenuity, designed to inject a new, slower terror into the familiar carnage. The condemned man chosen for the event was a thief, his body wiry and tense as he was prodded onto the sand. He was given a short, stabbing sword and a small shield, the pathetic tools of a doomed resistance. Across from him, the gate creaked open. but no powerful lion or bear emerged. Instead, a handler cautiously entered, using iron-tipped poles to guide a creature that seemed almost too small for the vast arena. It was a thick-bodied viper, its scales a pattern of dusty brown and gray, perfectly camouflaged against the sand. Its movements were slow, sinuous, and utterly devoid of the dramatic aggression the crowd expected. A murmur of confusion rippled through the stands. This was the great beast, the sluggish rope of scales. Spurius's cruelty lay in the delay, in the agonizing wait for a horror that was already unfolding invisibly. The viper had been captured days prior, its venom sacs left full, its fangs left unblunted. Its disposition had been manipulated through starvation and provocation, making it a primed needle of death. The condemned thief, expecting a charging beast, stood bewildered, his sword held in a shaking hand. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, trying to provoke a reaction. The snake merely coiled tighter, its head lifting slightly, its tongue flicking out to taste the air thick with fear. The strike when it came was not a dramatic lunge, but a blur of motion too fast for the eye to follow. A flash of pale mouth, a needle-sharp puncture on the man's calf, and then the viper was recoiling back into its defensive coil. The thief stumbled backward, more surprised than pained. He looked down at the 2 tiny beads of blood welling on his skin, a laughably small wound. A few in the crowd even chuckled, thinking the spectacle a dud, but then the poison began its work. The change was slow, then terrifyingly rapid. The man's confident stance faltered. He dropped his shield, his fingers suddenly unable to grip. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and he began to tremble violently. His breathing became a ragged, wet gasp as the neurotoxin seized his diaphragm. He collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing, his eyes wide with a dawning, helpless understanding of the internal ruin being wrought. He was not being mauled. He was being unraveled from the inside. The arena, usually a cacophony, fell into a hushed, fascinated silence, broken only by the man's choked, gurgling attempts to breathe. This was not a fight. It was a dissection of a living man, a slow-motion execution performed by an unseen chemical executioner. The viper, its role complete, remained a silent, coiled monument to Spurius's most insidious innovation yet. The hunt was over. The poison was hunting now. The roar that now greeted each new condemned soul was no longer one of simple bloodlust, but a chilling collective demand for creative suffering. The crowd had become connoisseurs of agony, their palates refined by a relentless diet of death, and their thirst could only be slaked by ever more inventive vintages of pain. The simple, efficient kill was met with bored murmurs. The Emperor's theatrical but predictable slaughters earned polite, perfunctory applause. What they craved was choice, a sense of participation in the grim theater below. And the games masters, ever attuned to the whims of their beast, were happy to oblige. The fate of the condemned would no longer be decided by a script or an imperial whim alone, but by the raised hands and shouted preferences of the multitude. The herald's voice boomed across the sand, announcing the next offering. A captured pirate captain, a hulking brute with a scarred face and defiant eyes, accused of plundering imperial grain ships, but his crime was irrelevant. What mattered was the choice presented to the crowd. The herald gestured to 3 prepared stations on the arena floor. To the left, a starved leopard, pacing in a tight, hungry circle behind a temporary barrier. In the center a cross, its wood fresh and pale. To the right, a brazier glowing with hot coals, and a set of iron pokers whose tips shone with a malevolent orange heat. The crowd leaned forward as one, a single organism of vested interest. The murmur that rose was not of confusion, but of eager debate. Factions formed instantly. Leopard, chanted a group from the lower tiers, eager for the swift, visceral thrill of the mauling. The cross, shouted others from the wealthier seats, their voices carrying the cold, patrician desire for a prolonged, exemplary punishment. But the loudest chant, the one that began to swell and dominate, came from the middle, thunderous, guttural roar of the irons. It was a choice that spoke of a profound and terrifying desensitization. A quick death by beast or a slow death on the cross were horrors they had witnessed countless times. But the red-hot pokers promised something different. Intimacy, specificity, prolonged and interactive torture, where the executioner's skill could be judged and the victim's reaction savored. It was a slower, more artisanal death, and the crowd, in its infinite hunger for novelty, voted for the masterpiece of pain. The pirate's defiance evaporated as the guards dragged him toward the brazier. The vote was not a suggestion. It was a mandate. The struggles were useless against the practiced hands of the arena attendants. They pinned him to the sand as the fire tender selected a poker, its tip a blazing star. The first touch was to the sole of his foot. The sizzle was audible even over the crowd's roar, and the smell of burning flesh, acrid and sweet, wafted upward. The scream that tore from the pirate's throat was not one of defiance, but of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that seemed to please the audience immensely. They cheered each application, each new brand on his skin, as if applauding a particularly skillful musician. Their votes had directed this symphony of suffering, and they watched its progress with a vested, proud intensity. They were no longer mere spectators, their collaborators, their collective will manifesting in the blistering of flesh and the cracking of bone. By the time the man fell silent, a smoking, ruined thing upon the sand, the crowd's approval was a physical force, a wave of self-congratulatory fervor. They had not just watched a death, they had designed it. The lesson was deeper and more terrible than any imperial decree, the true engine of the arena. Cruelty was not the emperor on his podium, but the thousands of citizens on the benches, their humanity eroded away, vote by bloody vote. The true horror of the games was not confined to the blood-soaked sand or the echoing screams from the cells below. It was woven into the very fabric of Rome itself, a venomous thread in the empire's economic tapestry. Lucius discovered this not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but through the dry, meticulous language of ledgers and supply manifests. His task had shifted from recording death to auditing its procurement. And in the columns of figures and lists of goods, he found a dependency more insidious than any addiction to spectacle. The games were a voracious economic engine, and its appetite fueled entire industries built on suffering. He tracked the river of coin that flowed from the imperial treasury to the far corners of the known world. It funded the animal traders, a ruthless guild of men whose caravans crisscrossed deserts and jungles, their cages filled with roaring, terrified cargo, destined for the spear and the applause. He saw the payments to ship captains who specialized in the dangerous transport of live predators. Their holds stinking of musk and fear, their profit measured in the survival rate of their living freight. Every leopard, every tiger, every stumbling giraffe represented a small fortune, a financial ecosystem that thrived on the capture and delivery of death. But the human cost was even more deeply enmeshed. There were the slavers and procurers, men with cold eyes and ready coin, who haunted the law courts and frontier outposts, always seeking fresh bodies to feed the arena's endless hunger. They created a market for human misery, where a strong back or a defiant spirit was valued only for its entertainment potential in a final violent performance. Bounty hunters grew rich, returning runaway slaves, knowing their reward was a ticket to the sands. Corrupt officials found a new revenue stream, condemning petty criminals for a share of the procurement fee, blurring the lines between justice and commerce until they were indistinguishable. Beyond the official trade flourished a shadow economy of vice. Lucius witnessed the frantic betting that took place in the shadows of the arcades, where fortunes were won and lost on the timing of a gladiator's death, or the number of passes a chariot would make before a prisoner was dismembered. Loan sharks circled the crowd, offering easy coin to those caught in the fever of the gamble, knowing they would be repaid with brutal interest. Taverns and brothels surrounding the amphitheater did a roaring trade. Their profits soaring on days of major games, their services a sordid epilogue to the bloodshed. The entire district had become a parasite, fattening itself on the corpse of the spectacle. The most chilling realization was the dependency it created. Armies of men carpenters, painters, engineers, butchers, cleaners relied on the games for their livelihood. To question the spectacle was to threaten the bread on their families' tables. The state, in turn, relied on the games to pacify the masses, to distract from grain shortages and political corruption with bread and circuses. It was a perfect, closed loop of complicity. The economy needed the games to function, and the games needed a constant supply of blood to continue. Rome was not just a city that hosted atrocities. It was a city that had built its daily life around them, a beast that now had to be. fed its regular diet of death lest the entire delicate structure of commerce and control collapse into hunger and riot. The sand drank blood, and in return the empire grew fat. The oppressive machinery of the games, once a monolithic horror, now revealed a hairline fracture. It was in the deepest, most forgotten storage vault, behind a stack of mildewed scenery from some forgotten nautical spectacle, that Lucius overheard the hushed, fervent whispers. He had been sent to retrieve old inventory scrolls, his footsteps muffled by layers of dust, when the voices stopped him cold. They spoke not of beasts or props, but of sabotage, of jammed mechanisms, of releasing animals not onto the sand, but into the service corridors to cause panic and delay. They spoke of a goal that made Lucius's blood run both hot and cold: to disrupt the games, to make them untenable, to starve the beast of its spectacle. He remained hidden, pressed against the rough, cold stone, his breath held. Hollow-eyed man who worked the pulleys for the elevators that raised beasts and men to the arena floor? Another was a woman, one of the laundresses who cleaned the blood-soaked tunics of the gladiators, her hands perpetually stained pink. They were not soldiers or philosophers. They were cogs in the very machine they plotted to break, their faces etched with the same resigned despair he saw in the cells. But in their whispers, that despair had been forged into a sharp, desperate purpose. They spoke of small acts, of tiny fractures that could, in time, make the entire edifice crumble. Sliced rope here, a handful of sand, and a gear mechanism there. They were not planning a grand rebellion, but a death by 1,000 cuts. The temptation to step from the shadows, to join his voice with theirs, was a physical ache in his chest. Here, finally, was a chance to push back against the horror he documented daily, to transform his passive witness into active defiance. The image of the philosophers' calm eyes, of the families in their silent, grieving rooms, flashed before him. These plotters offered a path to honor their memory, to spit in the eye of the empire that had turned death into theater. But as quickly as the urge arose, it was crushed by a colder, more familiar fear. He saw Decimus's flat, calculating eyes. He heard the crowds roar for the red-hot irons. He remembered the fate of the gladiators, who had rebelled, their bodies torn apart in creatively gruesome ways, their deaths used to reinforce the very power they had challenged. To join this resistance was not to choose heroism. It was to choose a place on the sand, to become another lesson for the crowd. His life as a scribe, however complicit, was a form of safety. He had a family back in the provinces who relied on his position. Stepping into the light would be a death sentence for him, and likely for everyone in that room. The whispers continued, weaving a fragile web of hope in the dust-choked air, but Lucius found he could not move. The fear was a chain heavier than any iron, binding him to his role as a chronicler of atrocities, a prisoner of his own desperate will to survive. He slipped away as silently as he had come, leaving the plotters to their dangerous dreams, his heart pounding with a shame that felt like a brand upon his soul. He had discovered a spark of resistance in the heart of the darkness, and his only act had been to retreat from its light. The air in the Flavian amphitheater crackled with a different, more vicious energy. A collective anticipation that felt less like bloodlust and more like a shared, cruel joke about to be told. The herald's voice boomed with a particular mocking flourish, announcing not a beast hunt or a gladiatorial match, but a special performance by a troupe of esteemed players. From the gates emerged a sight that drew not cheers, but a wave of incredulous laughter and jeers. These were no common criminals. They were men and women whose faces, though now pale and strained with terror, were once familiar from the highest echelons of Roman society, senators who had fallen from favor. A wealthy patrician accused of treason, the disgraced widow of a general. Their fall from grace was now complete, their final humiliation curated for the roaring mob. Stripped of their senatorial togas and fine silks, they had been forced into the gaudy, ridiculous costumes of low comedy. A once powerful senator, his belly shaking with fear rather than prosperity, was squeezed into the tight, sequined tunic of a dancing girl, a garish wig of yellow curls perched absurdly on his head. A proud matron, her hair now shorn like a slave's, wore the exaggerated mask and phallus of a vulgar mime, her trembling hands holding a set of clacking sticks. Their roles were not just degrading, they were a meticulously crafted inversion of their former status, a brutal farce designed to strip them of every last shred of dignity before their lives were taken. Their performance was a nightmare of coercion. They were prodded with sharpened poles by arena attendants, forced to dance clumsy jigs, to sing off-key songs praising the emperor's mercy, to perform Bodhi skits that mocked their own former power and pretensions. Each fumbled step, each cracked note, each humiliating gesture was met with a fresh wave of derisive laughter from the stands. The crowd, who would have once groveled in their presence, now reveled in their abasement, their laughter a weapon as effective as any sword. The nobles' faces were masks of utter devastation, their eyes wide with a horror that went beyond the fear of death. It was the terror of being erased, of having their entire lives and identities reduced to a final, grotesque punchline for the rabble they had once despised. This spectacle of degradation was the true execution, more potent than any physical torment. The actual moment of death, when it finally came, was almost an afterthought. As the laughter reached its peak, the actors playing the comedic soldiers in the skit suddenly drew real, sharpened blades. The jokes ended. The killing blows were swift and efficient. A jarring return to brutal reality that silenced the crowd for a single stark second before the applause erupted. The message was absolute and terrifying. Rome did not just kill its enemies, it unmade them first, turning their memory into a joke and their final moments into a lesson in the absolute, whimsical power of the state. The sand received their blood, but their true death had been the laughter, the sound of their own humanity being annihilated by the crowd's delight. The horrors Lucius had witnessed were no longer confined to the sun-scorched sand or the shadowed cells beneath it. They had seeped through his eyes into his mind and taken root in the dark soil of his subconscious. Each night, when the cacophony of Rome faded and the oil lamp sputtered out, the arena opened its gates within his dreams. There was no escape, no waking reprieve. The psychological toll of his grim chronicle was now being exacted in the currency of relentless, suffocating nightmares. He would find himself back in the sand, but not as an observer. The stylus and tablet were gone, replaced by the cold weight of a poorly balanced sword in his hand and the rough chafe of ill-fitting armor on his skin. He was one of the condemned, forced to play a role in his own terrors. The crowd above was a single monstrous face, its mouth a roaring void, and from the imperial box, the emperor's eyes glowed with a cold, divine amusement. In one dream, he was the political prisoner, feeling the clean, sharp kiss of the praetorian's blade, waking with a jolt, just as his head tumbled from his shoulders, his throat constricted in a silent scream. In another, he was the man sewn into the bull's hide, the stiffening leather becoming his coffin, as the dogs' barking merged with the crowd's laughter, their hot breath on his face, moments before he awoke, gasping and drenched in a cold sweat that smelled faintly of blood and straw. The guilt was a more constant companion than the fear, a leaden weight in his chest upon waking. His own hands, which had held the stylus, felt stained. Each neat column of figures, each dispassionate description of death, now felt like a personal betrayal. He had given order to the chaos, had translated screams into statistics, and in doing so, he had become a part of the machine. He saw the faces from the tenement districts, the mother, the old man. The young wife Anne knew that his ledgers were the final official record of their loved one's erasure. He had not wielded the sword or released the beast, but he had sanctified the act with documentation, had made it real and permanent in the archives of Rome. His complicity was quiet, bureaucratic, and it gnawed at him with the persistence of a rat in the walls. His days became a haunted mirror of his nights. The bustling forum, once a marvel of civilization, now seemed like a stage for a different kind of performance, its citizens merely players who had not yet been called to the sand. The smell of cooking meat from a street vendor would suddenly conjure the scent of the fire dance, the sight of a child dragging. A toy cart would bring to mind the terrible grooves left by the chariot of death. He was a man drowning in a sea of metaphors for horror, each moment of his waking life tainted by the memory of the spectacle. He ate little, slept less, and moved through the world with the distant, hollow-eyed look of the very prisoners whose fates he recorded. The arena had not just killed hundreds before his eyes. It was killing him by inches, eroding his spirit with the relentless, grinding sand of guilt and remembered screams. He was the chronicler of Rome's darkest heart, and the price of his testimony was his own peace, devoured bite by bloody bite in the silent feast of the night. The air in the forgotten storeroom was thick with dust and the scent of old. The MP would, but the three figures huddled within were oblivious to the decay around them. Their world had narrowed to the faint circle of light cast by a single shuttered lantern and the desperate, whispered words that passed between them. Lucius, pressed against the cold stone in the shadows, felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Each beat a drum of treason. The gaunt pulleyman, the laundress with her perpetually stained hands, and a new face, a hulking, silent orderly from the beast pens, were no longer just cogs in the machine. They had become its would-be saboteurs, and their plan was taking a terrifying final shape. The upcoming Games of Mars, the Herald had boasted, would be the greatest spectacle in the history of the Empire. A week-long orgy of death that would feature thousands of prisoners, hundreds of beasts, and unprecedented theatrical executions. For the Resistance, the scale of the event was not a cause for despair, but their one and only opportunity. The very chaos the Emperor sought to orchestrate would be their weapon. The plan, woven from strands of stolen knowledge and desperate hope, was a fragile and deadly thing. They would use the immense, distracting spectacle as a cover to strike at the heart of the operation, the main prisoner hold. The pulleyman, his voice a raspy thread of sound, laid out the details with a mechanic's precision. On the third day, during the planned nomachia, the flooding of the arena for a naval battle, complex hydraulic systems would be at their most strained. A carefully placed sabotage, a forged order for a diverted water flow, would cause a controlled failure. Not a catastrophic flood, but a significant leak into the lower service corridors. It's enough to create confusion, panic, and, most importantly, draw the guards away from their posts to deal with the emergency. The Beastpin orderly would use the ensuing chaos to release a handful of non-lethal but terrifying animals, wild boars, and panicked. Ostracized to the crowded hallways, turning confusion into outright bedlam. In that window of madness, while all eyes were on the flooded arena or the rampaging animals, the laundress and a few other trusted souls from the kitchen and cleaning crews would use their knowledge of the back passages to reach the main prison gate. They carried with them not weapons, but tools files and makeshift lockpicks hidden in baskets of soiled linens. Their goal was not a battle, but a quiet, swift breach. If the gods smiled upon them, they could open the cells for hundreds of condemned souls not yet scheduled for the sand, offering them a fleeting chance to vanish into the panicked, flooded labyrinth beneath the world's greatest slaughterhouse. It was a plan built on a dozen impossibilities, a gamble with the highest stakes imaginable. They knew the odds were astronomical. They knew failure meant a death that would make the arena's usual horrors seem merciful. But the alternative to do nothing, to be complicit in the slaughter of thousands for a week long. Festival of Death was a fate their souls could no longer bear. They were not soldiers. They were ghosts in the machine, and they were preparing to haunt it. A hush fell over Rome, but it was not one of peace. It was the breathless, anticipatory silence of a drawn bowstring. A city holding its breath before the storm. Then the trumpets sounded. Not the usual fanfare from the amphitheater, but a chorus of them from every corner of the city, their brazen voices echoing off marble, and brick announcing what every herald and crier had been promising for weeks. The Games of Mars were upon them. This was to be no mere spectacle. It was an event of apocalyptic scale, a week-long festival of death designed to eclipse all that had come before and stamp the Emperor's divinity upon the world in blood and fire. The proclamation, nailed to every public space and shouted in every forum, promised horrors of unprecedented imagination. 1,000 prisoners would die, not in simple executions, but in a grand, continuous narrative of conquest and punishment. 100 exotic beasts, many never before seen in Rome, would be hunted in elaborately staged environments that recreated their native lands within the arena. There would be a nomachia so vast it would require diverting an aqueduct, a mock siege with real fire and collapsing walls. And a final day, dedicated to the Emperor himself, performing a dozen labors of Hercules upon living, breathing substitutes. The flyers did not shy from the details. They gloried in them, each promise more extravagant and terrifying than the last. The city itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the coming carnage. Its normal rhythms subsumed by a frantic, dreadful energy as preparations reached a fever pitch. From his small room, Lucius could feel the change like a shift in atmospheric pressure. The constant rumble of carts heading toward the amphitheater was now a thunderous procession carrying not just sand and timber, but entire trees for forests, great quantities of salt for a synthetic sea, and cages within cages, their occupants roaring and shrieking in a dissonant symphony of doomed life. The economic engine he had documented was roaring at full capacity, consuming the wealth of provinces and the lives of nations to feed this single monstrous week. He thought of the plotters in the storeroom, their fragile plan a tiny raft on this ocean of impending bloodshed. The Games of Mars were not just an event. They were a declaration. Rome was showing its true face to the world, and the face was a grinning skull, promising a spectacle of death so grand it would be remembered for 1,000 years. The bowstring was released, and the arrow was in flight. The roar that greeted the first day of the Games of Mars was not the sound of a crowd, but of a single monstrous entity, its thousand-throated hunger echoing off the very pillars of the heavens. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a palpable, blood-fevered energy, thick with the scent of roasting meats, spilled wine, and the sweet, cloying perfume of impending slaughter. From his assigned alcove, Lucius felt the sound as a physical pressure, a wave that threatened to crush him against the stone. Below, the sand was a pristine, taunting yellow, soon to be baptized in the promised river of blood. But beneath that sand, beneath the feet of the cheering multitude, and the pomp of the imperial procession, another kind of energy was stirring, a silent, desperate current flowing against the tide. The plot, that fragile and terrifying seed planted in a dusty storeroom, began to germinate in the first hours of the spectacle. As the emperor dedicated the games to Mars' altar, Mars the Avenger, and the first condemned were driven onto the sand to be ritually dispatched by costumed priests, the resistance moved. Their actions were small and visible, designed to be lost in the overwhelming noise and pageantry. The pulleyman, his face a mask of bored concentration, subtly misaligned a gear in the great winch system for the animal elevators. It was not enough to cause a catastrophic failure, but enough to introduce a faint, grinding hesitation, a tiny flaw in the arena's perfect machinery. A delayed beast, a moment of confused silence from the crowd. It was a whisper of fallibility in the heart of absolute power. Simultaneously, the laundress moved through the crowded service tunnels, her basket of blood-stained linens a perfect camouflage. She did not meet anyone's eyes, her movements those of a woman who had spent a lifetime being invisible. At a prearranged junction she paused, pretending to adjust the load on her hip. Her fingers, quick and sure, slipped a heavy iron file from beneath the rags and left it in a shadowed niche behind a leaking water pipe. A dozen such drops were made that morning, a silent arming of the underground with the tools of liberation, each deposit a heartbeat of terrifying risk. The chaos they needed was still a day away, but the foundation was being laid. Every muttered curse from a bestiarius over a bulky cage door, every moment of confusion when a trapdoor stuck, every dropped tool each was a tiny victory, a grain of sand slipped into the gears of the great death machine. They worked with the quiet desperation of ghosts, their rebellion measured not in clashes of steel, but in these infinitesimal acts of sabotage. Each one a prayer that the machine would shudder, jam, and finally, blessedly, break. The games above were a symphony of power, but beneath the blood-soaked sand, a single, discordant note had been struck, and it was waiting for its moment to swell into a cacophony of revolt. The Emperor's signal was a flick of his jeweled wrist, a gesture so casual it seemed to suck the air from the arena. The main gates of the prisoner hold, a massive structure of oak and iron, began to grind open. This was the moment the crowd had been promised, the grand parade of the condemned, a river of human misery to be displayed before the slaughter. But the river did not flow as scripted. Instead of the expected, slow, defeated shuffle, a wave of desperate humanity erupted from the darkness. The rebellion, nurtured in whispers and tiny acts of sabotage, had found its moment. The first guard to die did so with a look of profound surprise etched on his face. A man with the wiry strength of a captured sailor swung a length of chain, torn from his own ankle, with the force of a wrecking ball. The iron links connected with the guard's temple with a wet final crack, and he crumpled like a discarded puppet. That single violent act was the spark in the tinderbox. The prisoners, hundreds of them packed into the suffocating hold, were not the broken wretches of the usual processions. They were men and women who had heard the rumors, who had seen the furtive looks and passed tools hidden in bread loaves. They had been given the one thing the arena was designed to destroy, a sliver of hope. They fought with the terrifying ferocity of those with nothing left to lose. Makeshift weapons appeared as if conjured from the air. Splintered plank from a broken pallet became a spear. A sharpened spoon, honed for weeks against stone, found its way into a guard's throat. They used the very chains that bound them as flails and garrots, turning the instruments of their captivity into tools of liberation. The narrow corridor leading from the hold became a charnel house of close-quarters combat. A swirling melee of screams, grunts, and the sickening thud of improvised weapons meeting flesh and bone. The guards trained for control and intimidation were utterly unprepared for this raw, chaotic explosion of will. Their formations shattered against the sheer, mindless force of the human tidal wave. They were dragged down, their superior armor and weapons useless in the press of bodies, their screams lost in the roar of the revolt. The prisoners, fueled by a collective desperate fury, fought not like soldiers, but like a single organism. Its only thought to escape the darkness and the certain death that awaited them on the sand. They were no longer victims. They were a force of nature, and they were tearing the arena's heart out from the inside. The roar of the rebellion was a sound the Flavian amphitheater had never been designed to contain. It was not the curated, bloodthirsty cheer of the crowd, but a raw, primal scream of desperation that erupted from the bowels of the structure and clawed its way up through the very stone. For a few heart-stopping moments, the carefully orchestrated spectacle on the sand faltered. Gladiators lowered their swords, beast handlers strained against suddenly restless animals, and the crowd's unified roar fractured into 1,000 confused shouts. The river of condemned, meant to be a docile parade, had become a torrent of fury, and it was flooding the service corridors, threatening to breach the arena itself. On the imperial podium, the shift in Commodus was instantaneous and terrifying. The languid, performative boredom vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of pure, incandescent fury. This was not a scripted interruption, not a novelty to be enjoyed. This was a personal insult, a defiance of his divine will, enacted on the stage he considered his own. The sanctity of his games of Mars, his grand offering to the god of war and to himself, was being violated by the very scum he had ordained for sacrifice. His knuckles were white where they gripped the gilded arms of his throne, his body rigid with an anger so profound it seemed to radiate a heat that those near him could feel. He did not shout. His voice, when it came, was a low, venomous hiss that cut through the panic of his advisors, a sound more threatening than any roar. His orders were not given to a herald. They were spat directly at the captain of the Praetorian Guard, standing rigidly at attention beside him. There was to be no containment, no negotiation, no attempt to recapture. The response was to be absolute, brutal, and immediate. The games were not to be paused. They were to be transformed. The staged battles were over. A real one was to begin. The emperor's command turned the arena from a theater of death into a battlefield. The Praetorians, who had been ornamental guardians of the podium, now moved with the lethal precision of a military unit. They formed ranks, their polished shields locking together to create a moving wall of steel that began to advance from the edges of the arena, driving the confused gladiators and performers toward the center. From the other gates, regular city guards and legionaries stationed for crowd control poured in, their faces set in grim determination. Their orders were clear: suppression through annihilation. The rebellion, born in the tight confines of the underground, met the open space of the arena and faltered. The prisoners, armed with little more than desperation and makeshift clubs, were met with a disciplined volley of javelins that cut down the front ranks like wheat. The following clash was not a fight, it was a massacre. The professional soldiers cut through the unarmed, disorganized mob with methodical, ruthless efficiency. The sand prepared for symbolic bloodshed was now soaked with the real thing in a quantity that shocked even the most jaded spectators. The crowd's confusion turned to a new, more complex frenzy, a mixture of horror and a grotesque thrill at witnessing a genuine, unstoppable display of imperial power. The emperor had not just ordered a suppression. He'd commandeered the spectacle itself, turning the rebellion into the ultimate demonstration of his authority. The message was written in the bodies piling up before the imperial box. Any challenge to Rome, any challenge to him, would be met not with justice, but with overwhelming theatrical and absolute violence. The games of Mars had found their true bloody purpose. The rebellion was a guttering candle, its brief, defiant flame all but extinguished by the cold, efficient brutality of the Praetorian Guard. The sand, once a stage 4 mock battles, was now a genuine killing field. Littered with the bodies of the condemned who had dared to dream of freedom, the chaos they had unleashed could not be so icily contained. It had seeped into the very bones of the Flavian amphitheater, a poison in the veins of the great stone beast, and now the beast began to convulse. The first sign was a faint, acrid scent that cut through the thick odors of blood and sweat, the smell of smoke. It began as a few tendrils curling from a service entrance near the beast pens, likely a spilled lamp or overturned brazier in the frantic fighting. But in the labyrinth of dry, timber-reinforced passages, packed with straw and discarded costumes, the fire found a feast. It grew with a terrifying swiftness, fed by the very props of the spectacle. Flames licked up painted wooden scenery, devoured stacks of old banners, and found the reserves of oil and pitch stored for the nocturnal games. Panic, which had been a contained thrill for the spectators, now became a genuine, overwhelming force. The first screams were not of delight but of pure, unadulterated terror as black smoke began to billow from multiple vomitoria, choking the lower tiers. The orderly advance of the Praetorians faltered as their own escape routes filled with smoke and fleeing citizens. The carefully maintained boundary between the arena and the crowd dissolved utterly. People scrambled over one another, a mindless stampede of silks and tunics, trampling the weak and the fallen in a blind rush for survival. Then came the groaning, a deep seismic sound that vibrated through the stone benches and up through the soles of thousands of feet. The fire, raging unchecked in the hypogeum, was consuming the wooden support structures that underpinned the arena floor itself. Sections of the sand, once the province of gladiators and beasts, now sagged and shuddered, with a roar that dwarfed the crowds. A great portion of the floor near the western wall collapsed inward, plunging a dozen Praetorians and a cluster of fleeing prisoners into a fiery abyss. The crash of collapsing masonry and the screams from below merged into a single hellish chorus. The amphitheater was no longer a symbol of Roman order. It was a monument to its unraveling. Flames now danced along the upper colonnades, fed by awnings and wooden seating. Chunks of carved cornice and shattered marble rained down on the mob below. The great velarium, the massive canvas awning that had shielded the citizens from the sun, caught fire, becoming a terrifying, burning canopy that dripped embers onto the screaming multitude. The world had narrowed to a single burning bowl of chaos, where performer and spectator, guard and prisoner were united in a common, desperate struggle against the collapsing, burning heart of the empire's greatest pride. The arena was falling, and it was taking a piece of Rome's invincible soul with it into the fire and the darkness. Smoke clung to the 7 hills of Rome like a shroud, a greasy, acrid pall that stung the eyes and throat, a permanent stain on the bright Italian sky. The air once filled with the roar of the crowd was now silent but for the distant, sporadic crash of collapsing masonry and the low, constant wail of grief from 1,000 homes. Lucius moved through the aftermath like a ghost, his scribe's tunic torn and smudged with soot, the scent of fire and death having seeped into the very fiber of his being. He had escaped the flaming chaos of the amphitheater not through bravery, but through a desperate animal scramble over fallen bodies and through smoke-choked archways, an anonymous speck in the tide of panicked humanity. Now, standing on a ridge overlooking the city, he looked upon the smoldering wreck of the Flavian amphitheater. Its great upper tiers were blackened and skeletal, a gaping hole torn in its side where the floor had collapsed into the inferno below. It was no longer a monument to power, but a corpse, its grandeur consumed by the very violence it had been built to contain. His satchel, clutched to his chest with a white-knuckled grip, felt impossibly heavy. Within it were his wax tablets and scrolls, the grim chronicle of the games that had led to this cataclysm. They were no longer mere records. They were relics, the last testament of a world that had devoured itself. He found a half-collapsed portico overlooking the Forum, its shadows offering a semblance of shelter. And with trembling hands, he began to add the final entries. He documented not with the dispassionate precision of a state scribe, but with the raw, bleeding urgency of a survivor. He wrote of the rebellion's spark, the emperor's rage, the terrifying swiftness of the fire, and the great groaning collapse. He wrote of the faces in the crowd, not as a unified monster, but as individual beings contorted in a terror they had so often cheered for in others. His stylus moved frantically, etching the horror into wax before memory could soften its edges, before the state could craft its own sanitized version of events. But as the immediate shock began to recede, a colder, more profound horror settled over him. His documentation was complete, a full accounting of the spectacle's birth, life, and violent death. Yet, the question that now echoed in the silent spaces of his mind was not what had happened, but why. Why had a civilization that had conquered the known world, that had built aqueducts and laws and roads, chosen to express its ultimate power in the orchestrated torture of thousands? He thought of Decimus, the betrayed who became the betrayer, of Spurius, the artist of death, the engineer Caius and his beautiful deadly designs. They were not monsters from a myth, they were men, products of a system that rewarded cruelty and commodified suffering. The arena had not been an aberration. It had been the purest expression of Rome's soul, a soul that had traded humanity for the addicting roar of the crowd. He looked down at the city sprawling below, the eternal city now shrouded in the smoke of its own hubris. The games of Mars were over, their promise of unparalleled glory ended in ash and ruin. But Lucius knew the hunger that had fueled them had not died in the fire. It was merely dormant, waiting in the heart of the empire. In the heart of every citizen who had ever raised a thumb for death, it documented the tragedy, but he was now certain it was not an ending but a symptom. The arena could be rebuilt grander than before. The real question was whether Rome itself could be. Rolling his scrolls and sealing them with a lump of wax that felt like a funeral rite, Lucius shouldered his satchel. It was no longer a scribe of Rome. He was its witness, and his testimony was a warning, written in blood and fire, for a future that might yet choose a different path.